हरिः ओम्। अद्य तद्धितप्रकरणस्य 40तमः वर्गः। प्राग्दीव्यत्यप्रक्रियायाम् अङ्गकार्यस्य अध्ययनं प्रचलत् अस्ति। येनाक्षरसमाम्नायम् अधिगम्य महेश्वरात् कृत्स्नं व्याकरणं प्रोक्तं तस्मै पाणिनये नमः। वाक्यकारं वररुचिं भाष्यकारं पतञ्जलिं पाणिनिं सूत्रकारं च प्रणतोऽस्मि मुनित्रयम्। तद्धितप्रक्रियायाः सोपानानि अस्माभिः पूर्वेषु वर्गेषु दृष्टानि। तत्र अङ्गकार्यस्य अध्ययनम् इदानीं प्रचलत् अस्ति। तद्धितप्रक्रियायां प्रत्येपरे अङ्गे यत्किमपि परिवर्तनं भवति तत् प्रायः त्रिविधम् अस्ति। आदिवर्णकार्यं, टिकार्यं तथा अन्तिमवर्ण नो चेत् उपधावर्णकार्यम्। एतेषु आदिवर्णकार्यस्य इदानीम् अध्ययनं ह्यस्तनवर्गे अस्माभिः प्रारब्धम्। तद्धितप्रक्रियायाम् आदिवृद्धिविधानं द्वयोः सूत्रयोः भवति। सप्तमाध्यायस्य द्वितीयपादस्य अन्तिमं सूत्रद्वयं तद्धितेष्वचामादेः तथा किति च। एताभ्यां सूत्राभ्यां ञित् णित् तथा कित् प्रत्यये परे अङ्गस्य आदिवृद्धिः विधीयते। एताम् आदिवृद्धिं बाधित्वा भिन्नैः सूत्रैः भिन्नेषु स्थलेषु केवलम् उत्तरपदस्य नो चेत् पूर्वपदस्य तथा उत्तरपदस्य नो चेत् वृद्धिं बाधित्वा आकारादेशः नो चेत् वृद्धिं बाधित्वा ऐच् आगमः एतादृशाः अपवादाः भिन्नैः सूत्रैः उक्ताः सन्ति। अतः सप्तमाध्यायस्य तृतीयपादस्य प्रथमसूत्रात् आरभ्य सप्तमाध्यायस्य तृतीयपादस्य 31 पर्यन्तं यानि कानि सर्वाणि सूत्राणि सन्ति एतेषु सर्वेषु आदिवृद्धेः अपवादाः प्रोच्यन्ते। एतेषु सर्वेषु अस्माभिः उत्तरपदाधिकारस्य तथा पूर्वपद उत्तरपदद्वयोः अपि वृद्धिः भवति अस्मिन् विषये ह्यस्तनवर्गे विस्तारेण अध्ययनं कृतम्। So if we see this entire sheet, we have 731 onwards apavadas for the adivruddhi. An important section that starts at 7310 is uttarapadasya, which is an adhikara sutra, and everything that follows gives only uttarapada vruddhi. And embedded inside that is somewhere in 7319 there is an additional anuvritti of purva pada. So this is not an adhikara, but there is an additional anuvritti of purva pada that comes in, and therefore for all the sutras that follow we have purva pada vruddhi as well as the uttara pada vruddhi. A lot of these sutras we skipped in the yesterday's class because they are similar. What I want to do today is understand these remaining sutras starting from 731 देविकाशिंशपा दित्यवा दीर्घसूत्रश्रेयसामात् इति आरभ्य श्वादेरी इति यावत् यानि सूत्राणि सन्ति एतेषां विषये किञ्चित् अधिकं शास्त्रस्य अपि अध्ययनम् अस्ति। अतः एतेषां विषये इदानीम् अध्ययनं कुर्मः। So before that I wanted to discuss a few things. So after the yesterday's class, after the recording was over, there was actually some discussion about all these sutras that we studied yesterday, and some very interesting questions came up which I think are worth repeating today because it's worth recording so that those who are attending the classes offline can also be benefited from them. So I don't have slides on these questions, but I'm just going to speak out and explain the stuff. Please pay attention. So the first question that was asked was regarding this Taddhiteshvachamadehe. So if we go to this sutra Taddhiteshvachamadehe, and let's go in the list where it appears in the listing. So yesterday I explained that in this sutra Taddhiteshvachamadehe, achoniti ityatah achaha iti anuvartate. किमर्थम अनुवर्तते? यदि अत्र अचः इत्यस्य अनुवृत्तिः न क्रियते तर्हि इको गुणवृद्धि इत्यनेन इक् परिभाषा अत्र आगच्छेत्, तथा केवलम् इक् वर्णस्यैव वृद्धिः अत्र भवेत्, परन्तु तादृशं नेष्यते यः कोऽपि प्रथमः स्वरः अस्ति तस्यैव वृद्धिः करणीया। अतः अत्र अचः इति अचोञिति इत्यस्मात् अनुवर्तते इति स्पष्टीकरणं मया दत्तम्। अस्मिन् विषये एकः प्रश्नः पृष्टः, So the question says that Iko Guna Vruddhi is a paribhasha. So the paribhasha is typically invoked when there is an aniyama, or when there is some ambiguity, some confusion, some lack of clear direction. So we know aniyame niyamakarani paribhasha. In this particular context, in this particular sutra, Taddhite Shvachamadehe, things are pretty clear. I mean, it is very clearly written that the first swara will get, the first of all the swaras will get a vruddhi. So it is perfectly clear which swara gets a vruddhi. There is no ambiguity, there is no aniyama, and therefore, technically speaking, we should not be invoking the Iko Guna Vruddhi paribhasha. So the answer to this question is that this is not really the way to look at the paribhashas. So paribhashas will be invoked unless there is a contradiction or unless there is a conflict that gets generated because of invoking the paribhasha. If by invoking the paribhasha there is no conflict, rather if by invoking the paribhasha the meaning is enhanced, the meaning becomes more clear, the meaning becomes more appropriate, then all that it means is that the ikapari or any paribhasha to that matter is always necessary over there. And even if without the paribhasha you think that the sutra is complete, that is merely your illusion. So the sutra is not complete. It is only giving you an illusion that it is complete. It is incomplete, and it is the paribhasha which is coming over there and making the sutra complete. So atra Taddhite Shvachamadehe ityatra yadyapi sutram sampurnam asti iti bhasate parantu tatha nasti yataha iko guna vruddhi anaya paribhashaya atra arthavardhanam eva bhavati. So the meaning is not contradicted, the meaning is not, it doesn't come under trouble, but the meaning is enhanced. And therefore, we almost always invoke such paribhashas, even if we think that the base meaning indicated by the sutra is complete in its sense. Now I'll give you another example where exactly same situation comes up. And therefore, it might be, once you understand that example, it might be easier to grasp this. So this is not an exception that, there is an apparent complete meaning and adding an ik paribhasha enhances it ahead. So if you go to the sutra, Puganta Laghu Padasya Cha, I mean, those of you who have studied little bit of Pinganta Prakriya know this sutra, Puganta Laghu Padasya Cha. So the Puganta Laghu Padasya Cha, so we can forget about this Puganta part for now. What this Puganta Laghu Padasya Sutra says is that for an anga which is a Laghu Padha, that is, if the anga has a Upadha letter which is Laghu, if yadi angasya Upadha varnaha Laghu samyakaha asti, tarhi tadrushasya angasya sarvadhatuke ardhadhatuke pratyaye cha pare gunaha bhavati. So we ignore where all these anuvrittis are coming, but basically if you take an anga which is a laghu padha, then that anga will undergo a guna. Okay, so please understand the sutra does not say that the laghu padha swara will undergo a guna. The sutra says that laghu padha anga will undergo a guna. So if you see, the meaning is very clear. Sarvadhatuke ardhadhatuke pratyaye cha pare laghu padhasya angasya gunadeshaha bhavati. Even in Kashika Vritti, it says Pugantasya angasya laghu padhasya cha sarvadhatuka ardhadhatukayoho gunaha bhavati. So that laghu padha is for anga. So now we can easily invoke alontyasya paribhasha over here, and we can say that antima varnasya gunaha bhavati. Because it is angasya gunaha bhavati, we have to bring in some last letter over here. So antima swarasya gunaha bhavati. So if we invoke the alontyasya paribhasha over here, then the meaning seems to be complete. Yakopi laghu padha shabdaha asti tasya antima varnasya antima swarasya gunadeshaha bhavet iti tatra arthaha jayate. But that's not exactly complete meaning, in this particular context also, we bring in Iko Guna Vruddhi Paribhasha, and that Gunadesha will happen only for an equal letter, not otherwise. So if you have an equal letter and which is at the last position, obviously. So that was the first question, that Iko Guna Vruddhi iti kimartham agacchati. Tatra uttaram etat yat Iko Guna Vruddhi ityanena arthasya vardhanam bhavati. Ataha atra Iko Guna Vruddhi iti agacchati. The second question that was asked is that, so this Iko Guna Vruddhi is causing a problem, and therefore we are bringing in the Anuvritti of Achaha. So if we see in the list, there is Achoniti, Ityatra Achoniti, Ityatra Ityasmat Achaha, Ityasya Anuvrittihi Bhavati. Kimartham Bhavati? Iko Guna Vruddhi Ityanena Ik Paribhasha Upatishthate. So the question is, what will happen if Panini would have said Ako Guna Vruddhi instead of Iko Guna Vruddhi? So if he says Ako Guna Vruddhi, then there is no need of bringing in Acha from this sutra. So the answer is that Ika Paribhasha has a pretty wide scope, not just this particular place. So there will be hundreds of other places where Ako Guna Vruddhi will cause a trouble. A common example is say Da Dhatoho Lut Pratyanta Rupam Kurmaschet. Da plus Lut इत्यत्र सार्वधातुकार्धधातुकयोः अनेन सूत्रेण अत्र गुणविधानं भवितुम् अर्हति, परन्तु न भवति यतः गुणः केवलम् इक् वर्णस्यैव भवति. So had it been Ako Guna Vruddhi, we would have been forced to do a guna even for the akara in that dhatu da. So da plus lut ityatra akarasya gunadesham krutva the plus lut agre ato guna ityanena guna purvarupa eka pararupa ekadesham krutva danam iti tatra anishtam rupam abhavishyat yadi Ako Guna Vruddhi iti Paninina sutre avadishat. But Panini has said Iko Guna Vruddhi, so we do not apply the sarvadhatuka ardhadhatuka yoho in case of examples like da plus lut or ya plus lut and so on. So that was the second question, and therefore we cannot have Ako Guna Vruddhi. The third question, rather question, more than question, it was actually my slip of tongue which was like pointed out. So I mentioned in discussion of Taddhite Shvachamadehe, I mentioned that Kashika Kara says Acham Adehe Vruddhihi Antyopalakshanam Vruddhim Badhate. So we were comparing the two sutras Ata Upadhayaha and Taddhite Shvachamadehe. So this 72117 and the immediate previous sutra Ata Upadhayaha. So we were comparing these two sutras, and then I said that it is the Adi Vruddhi which blocks the Antyopalakshana Vruddhim. And then I incorrectly said that Mahabhashya talks more about this. So I mean Mahabhashya does talk more about this, but Mahabhashya doesn't talk more about what Kashika Kara has written. I mean Mahabhashya came first, Kashika came later on. So it is not correct to say Kashika says something and then Mahabhashya Kara talks more about it. So the point is Mahabhashyakara discusses this aspect independently, and Kashika has picked up the relevant stuff from Mahabhashya. So again, thanks for pointing this out. Kashika came much later. It was Mahabhashya which came up first. And so Kashikakara's statements will be explained by Nyaas and Padamanjari. Sometimes also probably by Balamanorama and Tattvabodhini, because both of these came much after Kashika, but not by Mahabhashya. So that was the third one. There was yet another question which asked how these words like Ardhavarshika or Ardhapakshika or even Ardhadainika are actually derived. So this was related to, I think, Uttarapadadhikara. So there was one sutra that we discussed in the Uttarapadadhikara. So Avayavadrutoho is the sutra that we discussed. So in this sutra, we said that Purva Varshikam, Apara Varshikam, Ityatra Varsha iti Shabdaha Tatra Asti, Rutuvachi Asti, Ataha Anena Sutrena Atra Uttarapadasya Vruddhi Bhavati, Purva Varshikam, Apara Varshikam iti Bhavati. But if you say Varsha as a word, then how do we, derive words like Purva Varshika or Ardha Varshika or Ardhapakshika or Ardhadainika and so on? So I don't have an answer to this question. I don't think these words, I mean, I looked up Vachaspatyam, I looked up Shabdakalpadruma. None of these two books, they really give these two words, like Ardha Dainika and Ardha Pakshika and Ardha Varshika and all that. So honestly, I don't know if these are, you know, legitimate words according to the Paninian grammar, or they just came in the language sometimes later or whatever. So Ardha Varshika can still be justified, because if you go to this list of sutras, then there is this Varshasya Abhavishyati sutra over here. So Sankhya-vachinah shabdat paraha yadi Varsha shabdah agacchati tarhi yunitta yita kita pratyay pare kevalam uttara padasyeva adivruddhi bhavati. So it says Sankhya-vachinah shabdat, but we can argue that this word Ardha is also a kind of a number. So that is, you know, subject to discussion, but we can argue that. And then we say Ardha plus Varsha. Ityatra Sankhya-vachinah shabdat anantaram Varsha shabdah atra agacchati. Ataha Ardha plus Varsha ityatra kevalam uttara padasyeva adivruddhi bhavati Ardha varshika iti bhavitum arhati. Similarly, we can, you know, justify the word like Ardha Samvatsarika, because the immediate previous sutra says Sankhyayaha Samvatsara Sankhasya cha. So Sankhya-vachina shabdat parha yadi Samvatsara shabdah agacchati tarhi uttara padavruddhi eva bhavati. So if you have Ardha plus Samvatsara, you can justify Ardha Samvatsarika by, you know, saying Ardha is also a Sankhya. So the example over here is Dvi Samvatsara. So just like Dvi Samvatsara, maybe we can justify Ardha Samvatsara. So again, this is all subject to debates, but there is a way to justify words like Ardha Samvatsarika, Ardha Varshika and all that. So if you take the word Ardha Masika, I don't know how to justify it at all. So probably you can put it in Anushatikadinam cha. No, but that would be Ardha Masika. So Anushatikadinam cha, Anushatikadi Gana is an Akriti Gana. So you can put words in Anushatikadi Gana based on, you know, regular usage. But Anushatikadi Gane Pathitanam Shabdanam Vishaye Ubhayoho Adivruddhi Bhavati. So it would ideally then be Ardha Masika or Ardha Dainika or Ardha Pakshika. So all these words, subject to their existence in the Anushatikadi Gana, you can justify them. But if you take these very popular words like Ardha Varshika or Ardha Pakshika or Ardha Dainika, so I really don't know how to derive them, and they are not there. I looked up their derivations in Vachaspatyam Shabdakalpadruma. I also discussed with someone there. It's not there in Apte's dictionary also. So I really have no clue how these words are derived. Anyway, so these were certain questions that came up after the yesterday's discussion, and they were worth discussing in the class. So I took out some time in talking about them. So with this now, we can go to the material that we want to discuss today. Adivruddhim badhitva akaradeshah bhavati, nochet adivruddhim badhitva aich agamah bhavati. So the first sutra of Tritiyadhyaya Tritiya Pada 7.3.1. So this is the only sutra that gives Adivruddhim badhitva akaradeshah. So Devika Shinshapa Dityava Dirghasatra Shreyasamat Ityetesham Shabdanam Vishaye Adiswarasya Kitta Nitta Yita Pratyaye Pare Akaradeshah Bhavati. So very simple sutra actually. There is some Shastra, that's why I did not take it in the yesterday's class. But on the face of it, it's very simple. There are like 5 words given. Devika, I think it's name of a river. Shinshapa, it's name of a tree. Dityava, Dirghasatra, names of probably kings, I think. Shreyas, Eteshu Shabdeshu Vidyamanasya, Adiswarasya, Nitta Yitta Kitta Pratyepare, Akaradeshah Bhavati. And this Akaradeshah Bhavati, it is actually Adivruddhim Badhitva Akaradeshah Bhavati. So only when there is a prasakti of Adivruddhi, you have to block it and make an Akaradesha, not randomly. So Adivruddhim Badhitva Atra Akaradeshah Bhavati. What is an example? Devika plus Ana, Daivika iti na bhavati, अपितु प्रथमस्वरस्य आकारादेशः भवति दाविक. So that's the first sutra. Devika Shinshapadityavaha Dirghasatra Shreyasamat Eteshu Sarveshu Etesham Sarvesham Vishaye Adisvarasya Vruddhim Badhitva Akaradeshaha Bhavati. So in the sutra, please understand it is Devika Shinshapadityavad. So I think it's there somewhere in the sutra. I think it will be Devika Shinshapadityavad. So that's because of the sandhi. Dityavaha tasya prathama ekvachanam hodhaha ityane dhakaraha justve dhakaraha. So Devika Shinshapadityavad Dirghasatra Shreyasam At. But the original is Hakaranta word, just like Vishwavaha, this is Dityavaha. So Etesham Vishaye Ete Shu Sarveshu Pratyeshu Pareshu Kitnit Pratyeshu Pareshu Akaradesha Bhavati. Devika becomes Davika, Shinshapa becomes Shanshapa, Dirghasatra becomes Darghasatra, Shreyasa becomes Shrayasa. Dityavaha becomes Datyauha. So there is this Etye Dhatyutsu and Vaha Uthaiti Samprasaranam. The prakriya is given on the screen. Now the interesting point about these words is that this Akaradesha is required or it is expected even when these words are at the beginning of something and even when these words are at the end of something. So there is a Tadadi Vidhi and there is a Tadanta Vidhi. Both of these Vidhis are really expected over here. So you say Tadadi Vidhi atra ishyate. Devika Kula plus Ana ityasya vishaye api atra akaradesha bhavati. Devika Kula plus Ana becomes Davika Kula. Tadantasya vishaye api keshuchana sthaleshu bhavati. So Purva Devika plus Ana ityatra Purva Davika. So this is the sutra that we studied yesterday. Prachang Grama Nagaranam ityanena Uttarapadaseva Vruddhi Bhavati. So Uttarapada is Grama. As I mentioned, Devika is a name of a Grama. So a Grama which is on the eastern side, if that is Uttarapada, tasya vishayapi Adi Vruddhim Badhitva atra akaradesha vidhiyate. So you need a Tadadi Vidhi and you need a Tadanta Vidhi, and this is very unusual. So Tadanta Vidhi is still acceptable because we have this statement which says, or Paribhasha I think, which says Padangadhikare tasya cha Tadantasya cha. So in a Padadhikara and in the Angadhikara, whatever karya has been told for an entity, the same karya happens for the Tadanta also. So for example, Jaraya Jarasandhyadarasyam ityanena yat karya muktam asti tat nirjara no chet ajara asya vishaya api bhavati. This is one example. Or say Diva Auta ityanena uktam karyam asti tat Diva shabdasya vishaya api bhavati Sudiva shabdasya vishaya api tasya prasakti asti, and so on. So typically in the Padadhikara and Angadhikara, Tadanta is very common. So remember, Pratyaya Vidhau Tadanta Vidhi Nasti. So we have been continuously saying that Tadanta Vidhi is not there for Pratyayas. But typically for the Angadhikara, there is Tadanta Vidhi. And therefore, Tadanta Vidhina Atra Purva Devika Ityatra Purva Davika iti Prayaha Bhavitum Arhati. But still, Tadadi Vidhi is the one that remains unexplained. So we need a Tadadi Vidhi over here, but we don't have a real, proof in the sutra, or there is no way to interpret the sutras in which a Tadadi Vidhi would be acceptable. Okay, so Tadadi Vidhi is not a common thing at all. You do not get the Tadadi Vidhi in Angadhikara. So for example, if you say Diva Uta ityanena Diva Shabdasya Auta or Uta Adesha Bhavati, so that Diva, instead of Diva, if you have say Divaraj or whatever, then that initial fragment Diva is not going to undergo the corresponding Auta Adesha on the account of Tadadi Vidhi. There is no Tadadi Vidhi in Angadhikara and Padadhikara. Tadanta Vidhi is there, so second part might still be acceptable, but we need a way to explain this first part, and that's where the commentaries come in the picture. So in Nyaasa or even in the Kashika, in the Bhashya, they have done a detailed analysis of this sutra, trying to justify why Tadadi Vidhi really appears or occurs for this sutra. So maybe in next 30 or say 20 minutes, we want to discuss that aspect from the Shastra. So this is a little bit complex. That's why I didn't want to take it in the yesterday's class. So the point is, there is this sutra, Devika Shinshapa Dityava Dirgha Satra Shreyasamat. Out of that, there is this first word, Devika Shinshapa Dityavaha Dirgha Satra Shreyasam. This is all Shashti Bahuvachanam. And then this is in the Angadhikara. So Angasya also comes and sits next to it, which is also Shashti. So there is this Angasya, which is Shashti. And there is this Devika Shinshapa Dityavaha Dirgha Satra Shreyasam, which is Shashti. And the question that these commentaries ask is that what is the relation between these two words? So we have Devika Shinshapa Dityava Dirgha Satra Shreyasam. So now onwards, I'm going to just call this whole thing as Devika. I mean, doesn't make sense to pronounce it everything. So there is this word Devika and so on in one place, and there is this Angasya in the other place, and both of them are in Shashti. So typically, when the two words are in the same vibhakti, one of them is usually Visheshana and other is Vishesha. So this is extremely common. So for example, when we say Ramaha Shuraha Asti, one of them, both of them are in Prathama, or say Aham Madhuram Phalam Khadami, both of them are in Dvitiya, or so we can pick up any example. Say Aham Jeshthaya Putraya Dadami, both of them are in Chaturthi. In all such cases, wherever there is a Samanadhikarana, one of them is always a Visheshana and other is a Visheshya. So the commentaries pick up this thread and they say which of these two is really a Visheshana and which of these two is really a Visheshya. The first case that they put forth is that this word Devika Shinshapa and so on is a Visheshana and Angasya is a Visheshya. So what does it mean? Devika ityasya angasya akaradesha bhavati. So angasya akaradesha bhavati is main, and the word Devika adds an extra qualification to angasya. So angasya akaradesha bhavati, but whose angasya? Devika dinam angasya akaradesha bhavati. So Ramaha asti, Shuraha Ramaha asti. So we add an extra qualifier to that Rama, we say Shuraha. In the same way we say over here that Angasya Akara Desha Bhavati. But how is that Anga? It's not any random Anga. It is the Anga of Devika or Shinshapa or Dityavaha or Dirghasatra or Shreyasa. Etesham Sarvesham Angasya Akara Desha Bhavati. So then you have Devika plus Ana, Davika, Shinshapa plus Aya, Shanshapa, Dirghasatra plus Ana, Darghasatra, Shreyas plus Ana, Shrayasa. Sarvatra Angasya Akaradesha Bhavati. So these four words, Etesham Angasya Akaradesha Bhavati. The problem with this approach is that Angadhikara does not have a Tadadi Vidhi. As we just now mentioned like 5 minutes ago. Angadhikara does not have a Tadadi Vidhi. So if you just say Angasya Akara Desha Bhavati, Angadhikara will not have the Tadadi Vidhi, and therefore Devikayaha Angasya. So see, Devikayaha Angasya iti uchyate chet Devikadayaha ye shabdaha etesham vishaye ishtaha akaradesha na vidhiyate. We want this to happen for the words like Devika Kula. However, if you just say Angasya Akaradesha Bhavati, Angadhikare Tadadi Vidhi Nasti, Ataha Atra Etadrushaha Devika Kula Shabdasya Vishaye Akaradesha na bhavitum shakyate, Ataha Atra Devika iti Visheshanam Nasti, Angasya iti Visheshyam Nasti. So the first, this whole thing is not a Visheshana and this is not a Visheshya. So this is the one part of the, it's a 3-part argument. So this is the first part of the argument, that this cannot be Visheshana and this cannot be Visheshya. So fair enough, let's flip them. So maybe Devika Shinchapadityava Dirghasatra Shreyasam is a Vishesha and Angasya is a Visheshana. So now see what is happening. Angasya iti Visheshana, Devika iti Vishesha. So now the Akaradesh is not to the Anga, the Akaradesh is to Devika. Please contrast this with the previous slide. In the previous slide, we said Angasya Akaradesha Bhavati was the first part, and then we qualified that Anga by saying it is Devika Shinchapadityavad and so on. So that was because the Angasya was Vishesha. In the current case, we are saying Devika Shinchapa and so on is a Vishesha. Therefore, Devika Shinchapa ityasya akara desha bhavati. The words Devika and Shinchapa are going to get an akara desha when they are part of an anga. So now it doesn't matter whether they are in the middle of the anga, they are at the end of the anga, they are at the beginning of the anga. If they are part of the anga, then these words are going to get the akara desha, not the anga. So we flip the argument and we say Devika Shinchapadityavad Dirghasatra Shreyasam iti Vishesham asti etesham vishaye akara desha bhavati. Angasya is an extra qualifier. So this Angasya becomes Avayava Shashti because that's a Visheshana, and therefore Angasya Avayava Bhutaha ye Devikadayaha, the Devikas that are the part of the Anga. Angasya de Avayava Bhutaha ye Devikadaya. So please understand this again. Ramaha Gacchati is a primary sentence. And then Shuraha Ramaha Gacchati, Unnataha Ramaha Gacchati, Vishalaha Ramaha Gacchati are all adjectives to it. In the same way here, Devikadinam Akara Desha Bhavati is important. And then whether it is Bhasya or Angasya or Padasya or Pratyasya and so on is all secondary. So we are saying the word Devika will get an Akara Desha. It must belong to the Anga. So Angasya Avayabhutaha ye Devikadayaha etesham vishaye Akara Desha bhavati. So now, just like the Devika word will get an Akara Desha, Devika Kula will also get an Akara Desha. Because we are not saying the Anga gets Akara Desha, we are saying Devika gets Akara Desha. It can be anywhere in the Anga. Therefore, you get Tadadi Vidhi, you get Tadanta Vidhi, you get the Akara Desha only for Devika alone. So Devika ityatra Akara Desha bhavet, Devika Kula ityatra Akara Desha bhavet. Then there was the third example which was on the previous slide. Purva Devika Ityatrapi Akara Desha bhavet. Why? Because the Akara Desha is only for the word Devika. And therefore it seems that specifying that Anga is a Visheshana and Devika is a Vishesha is sufficient enough. However, again there is a problem. What is the problem? If you consider this as an Avayava Shashti, then any random Anga which contains the word Devika will be subject to this Akara Desha. So, if you consider words like Sudevika, where we really don't need any Akara Desha, Sudevikayam Bhavaha ityatra Sudevika plus Ana ityalena Saudevika ityeva Rupam Vidhiyate, Parantu Atra Avayava Shashti iti Svikriyate, Noche Devika Shinchapa iti Vishesha Rupena Svikriyate, Tarhi Sudevika ityatra api Akara Desha Anishtaha Akara Desha Vidhiyate. So the akshep here is that Avayava Shashti Svikriyate chet Ati Prasangaha Syat. Ati Prasanga means crossing the boundary and forcing the application of the sutra in the places where the application is not desired. So Avayava Shashti Svikriyate chet Atra Ati Prasangaha api Syat अतिप्रसङ्गः इत्युक्ते सुदेविका इत्यत्र अपि देविका शब्दस्य दाविक इति अनिष्ट परिवर्तनम् अत्र भवेत्. So the bottom line is that we cannot treat angasya as a visheshana and devika as a visheshya. Why? Because the first slide, if you treat angasya as a visheshya, there is an under representation. Devika cool cannot be satisfied. If you do angasya as a visheshana, then there is an over representation. There is an atiprasanga word like sudevika, where we really don't want akaradesha, also end up in getting akaradesha. So what? So then there is a very specific third interpretation that the commentaries give, which is not really a visheshan vishesha bhavaha, but they say devika shreyasam sambandhi adibhutaha yaha acha. So this we learn only from commentaries, that there is this particular interpretation for this sutra. Devika shreyasam sambandhi adibhutaha yaha acha. And acha that belongs to, that is first of all at the beginning, and that belongs to these words devika shreyasam and so on, tasya vruddhi prasange akaraha vidhiyate. So if there is a vruddhi that is forced on that adibhuta acha belonging to devika and so on, that vruddhi will be blocked by akara. So the meaning that is given in the commentaries over here is that devika shreyasam sambandhi adibhutaha yaha acha tasya vruddhi prasange akaraha vidhiyate. The first acha that belongs to or that is related to devika shreyasa, so it may not actually belong to it, the one that is related to devika shreyasa, shreyasa, shinshapa and so on, the first acha which is related to them, etesham vishaye vruddhi prasange akaraha vidhiyate. Okay, so eteshu shabdeshu vidyamanasya adiswarasya akaradesha bhavati. So when we say related, it obviously follows that it belongs to them, but that doesn't really, I mean, the commentaries don't use that word. They say devika shreyasam sambandhi adibhutaha. So we will talk about the commentaries in a minute, but this is exactly taken from the commentaries. So they say devika shinshapa ityetesham sambandhi adibhutaha ya acha ityukte etadrusheshu shabdeshu vidyamanasya adiswarasya akaradesha bhavati. So what it means is that ete shabdaha uttarapada rupena no chet purvapada rupena agachanti chedapi vruddhim badhitva akaradesha bhavitum arhati. If there is a prasakti of the vruddhi, it will be blocked and we will get akaradesha. So see, devika plus ana ityatra davika de ityasya akaradesha bhavati. Devika kula ityatra devika iti purvapadam, kula iti uttarapadam, purvapadasya akaradesha bhavati. Why? Because devika sambandhi adibhutaha achasti. So this ach is the sambandhi of devika, and there is a vruddhi prasanga which is blocked and an akara is obtained. Purva shinshapa plus ana purva shanshapa. So purva shinshapa ityatra shi iti uttarapade asti. So by shinshapa is the name of a place, I think. So purva shinshapa nama pracham gramaha. So again, pracham grama nagranam iti atra uttarapada vruddhi bhavati. So there is a prasakti of uttarapada vruddhi that is blocked and akaradesha is created. In shinshapa sthala, there is a prasakti of purvapada vruddhi that is blocked and an akaradesha is created. In sudevikayam bhavaha, there is no prasakti of uttarapada vruddhi and therefore there is no akaradesha. So all this is again shastra, you can just feel free to ignore it. All that matters is that Adivruddhim Badhitva Akaradeshah Bhavati, and this Adivruddhi is not the Adi of the Anga, but it is the Adi of these words which might appear anywhere in the Anga. Okay, so Devika Shreyasam Sambandhi ya Adibhutaha yaha acha tasya vruddhi prasange akaraha vidhiyate. So with this, let's read the Vyakhya from Nyaasa. So I'm just going to read this thing now. Hopefully it will be clear. So this, I don't think it's explained in Kashika. Let's quickly take a look at it. So yeah, so this is not exactly explained in Kashika. All this is, however, explained in details in Nyaasa. Most of this whole thing is, I think, copied over here. So Taddhiteshvachamadehe ityantaratamyat aikare vruddhau praptayam devikadinam akarha vidhiyate. So this is very important, that when a vruddhi is being mandated, it is blocked by an akara. Taddhiteshvachamadehe ityantaratamyat iti antaratamyat iti antaratamyat. So sadharmya, for ekara you will get aikara, for ikara again you will get aikara, and so on. So for okara you will get aukara, and so on. So taddhiteshvachamadhe iti antaratamyat aikare vruddho praptayam. So he clearly says aikara because all these words, because of vruddhi, they will only undergo aikara. So devika will become daivika, shinshapa will become shai, dityavad will become dai, dirgha will become dai, and shre will become shrai. So everywhere the antaratamya is giving an aikara. So he says taddhiteshvachamadehe iti antaratamyat aikare vruddhau praptayam devikadinam akaraha vidhiyate. Atra pakshatrayam sambhavyate. So he explains the three pakshas. The first one which is written over here is actually the one that we studied second. The second one which is written over here is the one that we actually studied first. The reason will become clear in a minute. Actually, this second one is more basic than the first one, so I took it before. So, but remember that when you go back and revise, the first paksha which is written over here is the one that we studied second, and the second paksha that is written over here is the one that we studied first. So the first here says, Atra prakshatrayam sambhavyate prakrutena angena devikadayaha vishishyante. So devikadayaha vishishyante angena devikadinam anganam iti. So devikadi is a visheshana, anganam iti visheshya. That's devikadinam anganam iti. Tairva angam devikadyantasya angasya iti. So this is angasya. Anga is a visheshana over here, and here devikadi is the visheshya over here, and anga is the visheshya over here. So the first clause, let me make it even more explicit. The first clause says that angena devikadeha vishishyante. So anga is a visheshana, devika is a visheshya. That's the case number 2 that we studied over here. So devika is the visheshya, anga is the visheshana. That's the case number 2 over here. So it says prakrutena angena devika deha vishishyante. The second says taihi va angam. So taihi ityukte devikadi etaihi shabdaihi va angam vishishyate. So devikadyantasya angasya iti. So devika is a visheshana, anga is a visheshya. So that is the case number 1. Athava taihi adyaha acha. So what is the relationship? The relationship is the relationship of adiswara. Taihi adyaha acha. Devikadinam sambandhinam acham madhye yaha adihi acha iti. So these are the 3 pakshas, and then he talks about the first paksha and gives a contradiction, talks about the second paksha and gives a contradiction, and finally resorts to the third paksha. So he says, Tatra yadi adyaha pakshaha ashriyeta. If you go to the first paksha, which is effectively the second that we studied, so he says, Devika kule bhavaha shalayaha davika kula shalayaha iti na siddhyeta because he forgets about this avayava shashti. So this aspect is very basic, so I did not really discuss it. Actually, it adds more confusion for no reason. That's why I did not discuss it. You can read this line later on. He says, Nanucha angasya avayava shashti tatra evam visheshan vishesha bhavaha karishyate angasya ye devikadayah avayava bhutaha iti bhavati cha iha avayavaha angasya devika shabdaha tato ayam dosha adosha iti che. So first of all, he brings up a very stupid doubt, and then he says, no, this is avayava shashti, so this doubt is really not practical, is what is discussed in these 3 lines. I did not talk about it because it is only going to cause a confusion. I mean, first saying 2 plus 2 is equal to 5, making somebody believe that 2 plus 2 is equal to 5, and then saying, no, that's wrong, and it's 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. So that's kind of the argument that is given over here. An artificial question has been created, and it has been answered by saying it is avayava shashti, which is obvious because it is a visheshana vishesha bhava. So then he says the real problem that we discussed, ati prasangaha syat. So that's the case number 2 that we discussed over here. Ati prasangaha syat. So it goes beyond its limits. It also becomes applicable to places where it should not be. Ati prasangaha syat sudevikayam bhava saudevika ityatra api syat. So he says that's the problem. So you cannot really resort to this meaning. Atha dvitiya paksha ashriyeta evam api davika kulaha shale iti na siddhyeta. So basically, tadadi vidhi cannot take place is the objection over here. So he says, tadanta vidhi devika adyantasya angasya iti bhavitavyam na tadadehe. So tadadi vidhi cannot come, and therefore there is a problem with this. And then he says, tritiya pakshe tu ashriyamane vinapi yatnantarena kevalasya tadadehe tadantasya bhavati. So if you resort to the third paksha, then we will go to tadadi vidhi as well as tadanta vidhi. There is no issue, and therefore why is no issue? Because sarvatra acham adehe achaha devikadi sammandatvat. So the first acha, that is achvarana, that is present everywhere, is the one that we consider the one associated with the devikadi words and not to the anga. And therefore then he wraps up everything. De ata tam e ataha tam eva ityukte tritiya paksham eva ashritya aha, and then he makes the concluding statement, devikadinam acham madhye adibhutaha yaha acha vruddhehe aikarasya prasange tasya akaraha vidhiyate. So that's what exactly we said over here. Devikadinam madhye adibhutaha yaha acha tasya vruddhi prasange akaraha vidhiyate. So that's all about the commentary of this particular sutra. There is not much over here, except for, this all thing, but this whole thing almost took like 40-45 minutes. So atra Nyaas I have just explained all these things, the 3 cases. So if you see over here, he says atra pakshatrayam sambhavyate and so on. Siddhanta Kaumudi doesn't just talk any of these things about it, but Bhashya explains all this in detail. So devikadishu tadadi grahanam kartavyam na kartavyam and so on. So he explains all these aspects, which are also simplified by Nyaasa. So the bottom line, this has nothing to do with prakriya directly, this is all shastra, but the bottom line is that for these words devika, shinshapaditya vat and so on, their first swara, if it undergoes a vruddhi, or it is expected to undergo a vruddhi, that's blocked by the akara desha. So with this, let's go to the remaining sutras. Lot of slides more to cover. The next one, Kekaya Mitrayu Pralayanam Yadehe Iyaha. So this actually is not an appavada of Adivruddhi, but it says do Adivruddhi and do something else. So you see, Kekaya Mitrayu Pralaya Etesham Shabdanam, whatever yakaradi avayava. So yakaradi avayava means an avayava that begins with ya and goes till the end. So in case of Kekaya, it will be the full ya. In case of Mitrayu, it will be full yu. And in case of Pralaya, it will be full ya. So this yakaradi avayava tasya iya adesha bhavati. So Kekaya ityatra yakaradi avayava asti tasya iya iti adeshah bhavati Gunasandhim krutva kek plus iya, kekeya, and then you do adivruddhi as usual, kaikeya. So kekaya plus ana becomes kaikeya, mitrayu plus ana becomes maitreya, pralaya plus ana becomes praleya. So this is not blocking adivruddhi, but this is saying do adivruddhi and do something else. And that something else is basically iya adesha. So we say adivruddhi plus iya adesha. So that's all about this next sutra. Starting from 733 up to 739. So till the time Uttarapada Adhikara starts. So starting from 733 up to 739, we have the sutras that block adivruddhi and give an aicha agama. An example that we have studied long back in details is this vyakarana plus ana vyakarana. We studied this in Taddhite Tattveda, but we'll still consider it in today's class quickly. So this sutra na yabhyam padattabhyam purvaututadhyam aicha. Yadi shabde prathamaswaraha padanta yakarat nochet padanta vakarat paraha asti tarhi nitya yitya kita pratyay pare tasya shabdasya adivruddhi na bhavati. So that's the first statement. There are two distinct rules which are told over here. Padantabhyam vabhyam na. Kim na? Vruddhihi na. So any padanta yakara or a padanta vakara, if there is a padanta yakara and a padanta vakara and then there is a swara present after that, then you do not get an adivruddhi. So there is a purva pada which ends in a yakara and a vakara, and then comes the swara of that word, which incidentally happens to be the first swara of the entire word. In such a case, that swara does not undergo a vruddhi. So that is first aspect of this sutra. The second aspect says that instead purvaututadhyam aicha. So that padanta yakara or padanta vakara, before that you get an aicha agama. Let's see this with an example. So let's take this famous word called vyakarana. So vyakarana is actually nothing but V plus A plus karana. And here V gets a pada samnya because V is an upasarga. Upasargas get a pada samnya. So V is an pada samnya, and therefore when you combine this V and A, you are going to get Vya. Atra akaraha prathamaswaraha asti. Ayam akaraha prathamaswaraha padanta yakarat anantaram agacchati. So when you combine V plus A, you get a Vya and A, which is the prathamaswara. Please understand this ikara is not a prathamaswara because it is not present in the final word. We are talking about the prathamaswara of the final word and not prathamaswara of whatever dissection we are making about. So atra a ityeva prathamaswara asti. This prathamaswara akara, it is coming after a padanta yakara. So it is not coming after ikara. Iko yanachityane yanadesha bhavati. Atra padanta yakara asti. Padanta yakarat paraha atra akaraha agacchati. So there is this prathamaswara which comes after the padanta yakara, and therefore this prathamaswara does not get a vruddhi. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect says that instead this prathama padanta yakara which is present over here, before that you get an aicha agama. Aich is a pratyahara which consists of two things, I and au. So if there is a padanta yakara, you get an I. If there is a padanta vakara, you get an au by antaratamya again. So you have va plus I. So before this padanta yakara, you get an I. Va plus I plus ya, and then everything follows as it is, combined together to form Vyakarana. So the word Vyakarana is formed from the word Vyakarana in this way. we have this sutra called Naibabhyam Padantabhyam is the first fragment, Aicha is the second fragment. Okay, so another example is Swashva. So this is an example of Vakara. So Swashva is also again Su plus Ashwa. So the first swara is Akara, which is coming just before a Padanta Vakara. Su is a Padasamnyaka again over here. So Su plus Ashwa, Su is a Gati Samnyaka and therefore it becomes a Padasamnyaka. So Su plus Ashwa, Swa plus Ashwa, Vakara asti, Padanta Vakara asti, Tasmat Paraha Yaha Swaraha asti, Saha Prathama Swaraha asti, Tasya Adivruddhi na bhavat, Tasya Vruddhi na bhavati, Apitu Vakara Purvam Au Ityasya Agamaha bhavati, Swa plus Ashwa, Sa Au U. So there is an additional Au which is embedded between the Sakara and the Vakara. You get Sauvashwa. So this is how Adivruddhim Badhitva Aich Agamha Bhavati, only when there is a Padanta word at the beginning. So Padanta Yakara or a Padanta Vakara has to be there at the beginning, and then only we get this particular prakriya. So why only Padanta Yakara and Vakara? If there is a Padanta Refa, you don't get this. So na arthaha yasya saha, yasya saha. Na is a man, arthaha is say meaning or say wealth, whatever. So a person, probably his wife, na arthaha yasya saha, maybe his son, or maybe yasyaha sa ityatra na bhavati. Kimartham na bhavati? Na artha yasyaha saha. So this word is generated by this samasa. Na artha yasyaha sa nirarthaha. So there is na plus ra plus a. So there is a na plus refa plus a. So this word is generated by doing nru plus artha. So nru plus artha ityatra yanadesham krutva narartha iti bhavati. Tatra refaha padante asti because nru was a pada. Nra iti refaha padante asti bhavati. So nrartha plus iya ityatra kimapi na bhavati. There is neither aikara nor aukara which is generated. You straight away get adivruddhi narthi. So nrartha plus iya narthi is an example given in the commentaries. Padantabhyam iti kim? So even if there is a first yakara or a vakara, if it is not padanta, we really don't get this particular aich agama. So we have example is say yashti. Yashti iti prathamaha swaraha asti akaraha, saha swaraha yakarat paraha asti. So you have ya plus a, but this ya is not padanta and therefore you do not get an aich agama before it. So yashti plus ikaka ityatra yashtika iti bhavati adivruddhi eva bhavati. And then again another example which is probably much familiar to us, varsha plus thaka ityatra vakarat paraha akaraha asti parantu ayam padanta vakaraha nasti ataha varsha plus thaka varshika ityatrapi adivruddhi eva bhavati aich agamaha na bhavati. So this is basically the dalakrutya vabhyam iti kim narthi padantabhyam iti kim yashtika varshika. Now there are a couple of aspects about this sutra. I'll pick up two of them. Actually, there are three of them, but I don't want to go to the third one. It's a little bit ambiguous. So we'll go to the first and the second one. So Kashika says over here, Pratishedha vachanam aichoho vishaye prakluptyartham. So this is a statement that is given in the Kashika. Pratishedha vachanam aichoho vishaye prakluptyartham. So what is the meaning? So before we really understand the meaning, let's basically understand why did Kashikakara write this particular statement? What is the issue? The issue is that if you look at this sutra, then this sutra has two fragments. The first fragment says that this akara, so let's take this particular example, vya plus a plus karana. So this sutra says, the first part of this sutra says that this akara does not get an adivruddhi. The second part of the sutra says yakara, before that an ai comes. So it's the second part of the sutra. The question is, why do you really need the first part of the sutra? Even if you just say purvautu tabhyam aicha, so even if you just give the second part, then still you will end up in bringing an I over here, which is anyway going to be the Adiswara, and therefore this A loses its power of being an Adiswara, and therefore it anyway cannot undergo Vruddhi. So there is no reason to block the Vruddhi of a word or of an entity, which anyway will never get a Vruddhi, is the argument. So please understand the argument. Probably it will become even more clear when we talk about this second example, swashva. So if you say this swa plus ashva, atra na vabhyam padantabhyam iti prathamah bhagah asti sutrasya anena uchyate akarasya vruddhi na bhavati. So this akara, it doesn't get a vruddhi because there is this first part of the sutra. The second part of the sutra says this vakara gets an aukara before it. The argument is, as soon as this vakara gets an aukara before it, this akara, which was a possible target for a vruddhi, will never now be a target for a vruddhi because it is not an adiswara at all. And therefore, even if you say Vabhyam padantabhyam purvau aich, even if you say this much, we will be able to do an aich agama, and this aich agama will block the adivruddhi of the swara, which is no more first swara, and therefore there is no need of the first fragment of the sutra, is the objection. And the answer given by Kashikakara is that pratishedha vachanam aichoho vishaye prakluptyartham. So what Kashikakara says in this particular context is that this part, the pratishedha, which is presented in this particular first part of the sutra, is required because only when this pratishedha happens can an aich agama happen. So what Kashikakara is trying to say, or what Acharya basically meant when he wrote this sutra, is that first of all, this akara must get the prasakti of a vruddhi. If it does not get the prasakti of the vruddhi, this sutra is not applicable. Akarasya vruddhihi tatra vidhiyate tarhi eva step number 1 vruddhi na bhavati to aich agamaha bhavati. So if the first part of this sutra cannot be satisfied, so this first part of the sutra is effectively blocking the vruddhi. Na vabhyam padantabhyam is saying that the vruddhi will be blocked. So if the first part of the sutra cannot be satisfied, if there is no prasakti of the vruddhi, and therefore if there is no blocking possible, then you directly cannot use the second part of the sutra. The first part of the sutra is a precondition for the second part of the sutra, and therefore not having the first part of the sutra is not acceptable. Pratishedhavachanam aichoho vishaye prakruptyartham. So the insertion of aicha is gated upon this pratishedha, is what he's saying. Yatra yakarat vakarat parasya swarasya vruddhi prapnoti tatraiva sanishidhya tasmad yakarat vakarat purvam aich agamaha karaniyaha. Yakarat vakarat parasya swarasya vruddhihi na bhavati chet निषेधः अपि न करणीयः, निषेधः अपि न संभवति, अतः ऐच आगमः अपि न कर्तव्यः. And the example given over here is dadhyashva plus ya. So dadhyashva plus ya इत्यत्र दाध्यश्वी इति प्रथमस्वरस्य आदिवृद्धिः भवति. So there is a pada यकारात् वकारात् परस्य स्वरस्य वृद्धिः प्राप्नोति. तत्रैव निषिध्य यकारात् वकारात् पूर्वम् ऐच् आगमः भवति. If yakarat vakarat parasya vruddhi na prapnoti, so the swara which is after the yakara or the vakara in this particular word, the dhyashva does not get a vruddhi, and therefore it will not be blocked, and therefore there is no prasakti of the aich agama, and therefore a normal prakriya happens over here. So pratishedha vachanam aichoho vishaye prakluptyartham is one part of this vyakhya. Then Kashikakara says the second aspect of this vyakhya is that uttarapada vruddhehe api ayam pratishedha ishyate. So just like the way what we saw in Devika Shinshapa and all that, this pratishedha is also possible in the uttarapada vruddhi, subject to all these conditions, that if there is a yakara and vakara, padanta yakara and vakara, after that there is a swara which is undergoing a vruddhi. If all these conditions are satisfied, then that vruddhi is blocked and you get an aich agama even for the uttarapada. So purvatryalinda. So atra purvatryalinda ityatra purvatri and alinda. So alinda is the uttarapada, purvatri is the purvapada. So this can be broken down by saying purvatriya plus alinda. So half year goes in the purvapada, akara remains in the uttarapada. So you say purvatriya plus alinda ityatra purvatriya ityatra padanta yakara asti tasmat paraha alinda ityatra akara asti ayam akara adiswara asti. So all the conditions are satisfied. Uttarapada vruddhi is being given by the Shomadranam. So the 7-3-13 actually gives an uttarapada vruddhi. So therefore there is also a vruddhi. So the negation also comes in the picture. So all the conditions are satisfied, and therefore atrapi aich agamaha bhavati purvatri plus alinda purvatrai plus alinda paurvatrayalinda. Let me check what is the exact format. I think I might have mistyped it over here. So purvatrayalinda, correct. So purvatri plus alinda aich agamaha bhavati purvatrai purvatrai ya is half purvatrayalinda. So this is a typing mistake. This should be paurvatrayalinda. Purvatrayalinda, kshamyatam, purvatrayalinda, because uttarapada vruddhi is the one which is coming up. Purvapada vruddhi is anyway not there. So purvatri plus alinda, purvatriya plus alinda, purvatrayalinda. So I'll fix this. The correct form is purvatrayalinda. And the reason is because this whole vruddhi or pratishedha and aich agama which has been told also happens for the uttarapada vruddhi. So I think that's all about this particular sutra. The next one is again equally easy. So the next one says dwara dinancha. So again, very simple sutra. So there are some words which do not satisfy the condition given by the previous sutra, but these words anyway require an aich agama. So there is no padanta yakara vakara, and therefore the previous sutra cannot be applied, but we still require an aich agama for them, and therefore for such sutra words we get this gana called dwaradi gana. Dwaradinam chaityanena dwaradigane patitanam shabdanam vishaye api adiswarasa vruddhim badhitva yakara vakara purvam aikaraha nochit aukaraha agacchati. So dwara plus thaka, there is a half verb followed by an a. Now the word dva is not a padanta or is not a pada. Therefore this vakara is not a padanta vakara, and therefore you do not get the previous sutra coming over here. But still there is a vakara, there is a prathama swara, and it might undergo vruddhi because of the diteshvacha madehe. That gets blocked. Vakara gets an aukara agama before it, Dawaraka. So Dwara plus Thaka will become Dawaraka. Vyalkasha plus Ana will become Vayalkasha. So again, same thing. There is an Aikara agama present over here. So this word is little bit confusing because there is Vakara all as well as there is a Yakara. But the Akara which is going to undergo Vruddhi, it is coming after Yakara. So this example, Yakara is the one which gets an agama and not the Vakara that gets an agama. So Yakara will get an Aich agama before it, giving rise to Vayalkasha. So I think that's about this Dwara Dinancha. And then Kashikakara again speaks a little bit more details about this. It says Tadadi Vidhi Atra Bhavati. So Kashikakara says there is a Tadadi Vidhi over here. Dwara Palasya Idam Dawara Palam. So Dwara Ityasya tu Bhavati eva, parantu Dwara Palasya Ityatra api Bhavati. So there is this Tadadi Vidhi which happens over here, is what Kashika says. We are going to revisit this aspect maybe 10 minutes later, because this Tadadi Vidhi is always a very risky thing. Please always remember, Tadanta Vidhi can always be used, but all these aspects of this Tadadi Vidhis, you just cannot write them in the commentaries. They have to be justified in the Bhashya, or they have to be justified by the Acharyas. It's a very dangerous area to enter for absolutely unrelated reasons that we cannot talk right now. So this Tadadi Vidhi, we will talk about this, why Kashikakara says so confidently that there is a Tadadi Vidhi over here. So we are going to come revisit this aspect again. But for now, just understand that there is a Tadadi Vidhi over here. Next 3 sutras, just give me a minute. So we are almost nearing the presentation, just next 3 sutras, and then we will talk about this Tadadi Vidhi thing. So that was, I think, 734 Dwaradinancha. The next 3, na karma vyatihare, I am going to ignore. We'll talk about Nyagrodhasya cha kevalasya, Swagatadinancha, and Swadehe ihi. So very simple sutras. Nyagrodhasya cha kevalasya. So Nyagrodha shabdasya vishaye आदिवृद्धिं बाधित्वा ऐच् आगमः भवति. So न्यग्रोध शब्दस्य विषये आदिवृद्धिं बाधित्वा ऐच् आगमः भवति. न्यग्रोध प्लस अण नयग्रोध. केवलस्य इति किं? न्यग्रोध मूल प्लस अण इत्यस्य विषये मा भूत्. So let's see this commentary about it. न्यग्रोधस्य च केवलस्य यकारादुत्तरस्य अचामादे स्थाने वृद्धि न भवति ऐकारागमवति. Same thing. So whatever we discuss for व्याकरण द्वारपाल and so on इत्यत्र. न्यग्रोधस्य विकारः नयग्रोधः चमसः. केवलस्य इति किं? न्यग्रोध मूले भवाशालयः न्याग्रोध मूलाशालयः इत्यत्र मा भूत्. Now one thing I think read over here, but I am not able to quickly find it. So, this is what interesting. So what this Padamanjari says over here. This is very interesting aspect. So he says over here that kevalasya iti kim. There is this word kevalasya which is present in this sutra. Nyagrodhasya cha kevalasya tenena kevala nyagrodha shabdasya eva bhavati. Nyagrodha moola shabdasya vishay na bhavati. Now again, this brings us to the the topic that we discussed 5 minutes ago. Even if he says nyagrodhasya, how can it give rise to the prasakti of the sutra for nyagrodha moola? Because nyagrodha moola ityatrapi tadadi vidhi asti, and you do not use tadadi vidhi anywhere unless it's explicitly told. Therefore, you don't have a tadadi vidhi over here, and therefore, why do you need kevalasya is the point of discussion. Even if you say nyagrodha, this nyagrodha moola is not going to undergo the current sutra, or nyagrodha moola is not even going to be in the prasakti or in the boundary of the current sutra, and therefore you really do not need the kevalasya word in this sutra. So Padamanjari Kara says, atha asmin pakshe केवलग्रहणं किमर्थम. So why do you need केवलग्रहणं? यावता न्यग्रोधस्य इत्युज्यते तत्र कः प्रसंगः यत् तदादौ स्यात्. So why do you need a tadadi? I mean, where is the prasakti of the tadadi vidhi which you are blocking? And then he says, this kevala word over here is a jnapaka, that you can do a tadadi vidhi in this particular section of adivriddhi. So he says, jnapanartham tu etad jnapayati अस्मिन् प्रकरणे यान्युपातानि तानि तदादि विद्धिभाजः अचः विशेषणानि इति. So you will be allowed, or the tadadi vidhi will be acceptable in this particular section because of this jnapaka, which is kevala, which is present over here. So please understand, I am repeating this since the beginning of the class. Tadadi vidhi is not acceptable in general. It is not acceptable for all the adivruddhis. But this particular case where, Aich Agama is coming, this particular aspect section, you can do a Tadadi vidhi because of this Kevala thing. So this is, this is an indirect hint towards the previous discussion that we were doing, that you can have the Tadadi vidhi over here for Dwarapala. Why? Because there is an indirect hint present over here. Nyagrodhasya cha kevalasya. There was no need to talk about kevala. The fact that you have added kevala over here is for the Tadadi, is for, the license to use Tadadi vidhi. So let's quickly go through this part again. He says, kaha prasangaha yat tadadusnya jnapanartham. So this is a jnapaka that you might be able to, or you will be allowed to use tadadi vidhi over here. Here in the sense, not for this particular sutra, but in general for, in this particular sutra it is blocked, but in general for the Aich Agama cases, the section of Aich Agama, you can use the Tadadi vidhi. However, going ahead, there is even a direct indication that the Tadadi vidhi will be allowed in the Dwaradi Gana. So we will come to that. Before that, the next sutra is a Swakadatinancha, and Nakara comes as an Anuvritti from the previous sutra. So there is Na Karma Vyatihare, which we are ignoring, but there is this Nakara which goes to Swagatadinancha. So we say Swagatadinancha Na, which is very simple. So the words in the Swagatadigana, they do not get an Aich Agama, even if this Padanta Yakara, Padanta Vakara condition is satisfied for them. So you say Swagatadinancha ityatra nityit pratyeshu pareshu aikara aukarayoho agamaha na bhavati. So which effectively means that adivruddhe punarvidhanam bhavati. So Swagatadinancha ityatra adivruddhyeva bhavati swagata. So if you really see, it is su plus agata. There is a padanta vakara. So swa plus agata ityatra padanta vakara asti, but you do not get sauva gatika whatever. You say swagatika or vyanga plus iya vyangi, and so on. And the next sutra is also pretty easy, I think. Shvadehe iyi. So yasya angasya adau shvana iti shabdaha asti, tasya angasya iya pratyaya pare aukarasya agamaha na bhavati. Shva yasya adihi asti, shvadehe shva yasya adi asti, tasya shabdasya vishaye iya pratyaya pare adivruddhim badhitva Aich Agamaha na bhavati. So shvade in. So anyatra sarvatra tu bhavati eva, parantu iya pratyaye pare na bhavati. So shvadranshta. Shva yasya adihi asti is what we are saying. So shvadranshta plus iya shvadranshti. Ityatra iya pratyaya asti. Ataha atra aich agamaha na bhavati. So various specific sutras specifically for shva adi, shvadranshta, a bite by a dog, that specific word. And then there is a Vartika which says ikaradau iti vacham. So not just iya, but even if you say ika, which is effectively thaka, still you don't get an adivruddhi. Shvagana plus ika, shvaganika. So very specific sutra talks about a case where there is no aich agama. Now in next 5 minutes, we will do a little bit of dalakrutya of the shvadehe I and then stop. So basically, shvadehe I ityatra iya iti kim iti prashnaha. So in this particular sutra, why do you say that iya agre asti chet adivruddhihi na bhavati? Anyaha pratyayaha agre asti chet adivruddhi bhavati va iti prashnaha. So you could have just said shvadehe na. Why do you say I na? Or why do you say ikaradau iti na? Can you give me an example of another pratyaya which is not ikaradi and where you get an adivruddhi is the question. So iya iti kimartham. So he immediately gives an example. So you see here there was a shvadranshta and you get an iya, it becomes shvadranshti. But if you put an ana pratyaya over here, then shvadranshta plus ana ityatra adivruddhi bhavatyeva. So shvadranshta plus ana shauvadranshta ityatra tu adivruddhi bhavatyeva. So far so good. He says iya iti kim ana pratyaya pretu bhavatyeva. The question, the sub question that is asked, prati prashna upa prashna asti, shvadrashta ityasya vishaye, how do you even do an aich agama over here? So shvadrashta ityasya vishaye aich agamaha ki katham bhavati is the basic question. So how did you even, I mean, fair enough, iya ityasya vishaye na bhavati, parantu ana ityasya vishaye, which sutra did you apply over here? So shva is definitely not padanta vakara. So which sutra did you apply over here to get an out agama is the question. And the answer, yeah, there is this dwaradigana which we really used. So if you remember this gives the padanta yakara and this talks about the dwaradigana. So we say in case of dwaradigana, even if the words do not have a padanta yakara or a padanta vakara, we still get a vruddhi. So there was this shvadramshta word in dwaradigana and therefore I could do an adivruddhi for ana, and this is the, sorry, I could do an aich agama for ana, and this aich agama has been blocked by shvade specifically for iyam pratyaya. So shvadrashta shabdasya vishe aich agamaha kutak kriyate dwaradiganattvat. So then he says, I don't believe you. Let me open Dwaradigana and see what is there. So I don't really believe you that this Swandrashta word is in Dwaradigana, is what the next question that is going to come. So we open this and we see this Dwaradigana, and surprisingly, there is definitely no Shvadramshta word. There is a Shvana word over here, but there is no Shvadramshta word over here. So again, if you see the same list which is given in Kashika, slightly different list is given in Siddhanta Kaumudi, but none of these places have the Shvadranshta word. There is only Shva word over here. So Shvana, the dog, that's the word over here. There is no Shvadranshta word over here. So he says, you are cheating over here. Dwaradigane Shvan Shabdaha asti, Shvan Drashtaha nasti. And then the most important part, pratyaya vidhau tadadi vidhi pratishidhyate. So here you do not do a tadadi vidhi. Here means anywhere you do not do a tadadi vidhi. So whatever has been told in the shvana, how can you do for shvandrashta is the question. And the answer that is given over here is that yes, you are right. It is not possible to do it for the shvandrashta, but then this prakriya, specific prakriya would be useless. There would never be an aich agama which would cause this particular sutra to render useless, because you are doing a negation of something which is not existing in the first place. So for the sutra Shvadrashta plus Iya, you are doing a negation of Aich Agama, which means that the Aich Agama must exist over there, but there is no sutra to do an Aich Agama because the word Shvadrashta is not in the Dwaradigana. And therefore, this whole sutra will render useless, but no sutra in Ashtadhyayi will be useless. Therefore, existence of this particular sutra is a jnapaka that Dwaradigana will have a Tadadigrahana. And therefore, if you go like a few slides behind, we say that Dwarapala ityasya vishaye Dwaradigane तदादिविधिः भवति इति काशिकाकारः अत्र वदति. So द्वारपालस्य इदं द्वारपालम् इत्यत्र तदादिविधिः भवति. So काशिकाकार asserts this, that there is a tadadividhi over here because of the sutra that comes like 4-5 sutras later on, Shvadehe Iya. So to summarize all this, Shvadehe Iya says that a Shvadi word like Shvadranshta or Shvagana will not get Adivruddhi when there is an will not get Aich Agama when there is an Iya Pratyaya in front. Now, when he says it will not get an Aich Agama, obviously the thing that is expected over here is that there was some Aich Agama which was coming, which is now being blocked. And therefore, there must be an Aich Agama for the words like Shvagana and Shvadrashta, and that is only possible if Dwaradigana allows Tadadividhi. Therefore, we have to have Tadadividhi in case of Dwaradigana in particular. And this next sutra, Nyagrodasya Kevalasya, this Kevala word also allows Tadadividhi in other cases. For example, this Aich Agama. So, for example, I can't think of any examples quickly, but other play like Navabhyam, Padantabhyam, and so on. So, Etesham Vishaye Api Atra Tadadividhi Yatha Avashakam Chet Kartum Shakyate Dwaradiganasya Vishaye tu Bhavatyeva. So, this next sutra, Shvadehe Ya, is a jnapaka of the fact that Dwaradiganasya Vishaye Tadadividhi Bhavati. So I think there is only one sutra remaining which we are anyway going to Padantasya Anyatarasyam. So Yasya Angasya Adau Shvan Shabdah Asti Tatha Ante Pada Shabdah Asti. So specifically for the word Shvapada Tasya Vishay Anyatarasyam Adivruddhi Bhavati Adivruddhim Badhitva Aich Agamaha Api Vikalpena Bhavati. So Iya Pratyapare Nityam Adivruddhi Vikalpena Aich Agama. So Shvapada plus Ana Shvapada or Shava Pada. So Padasya Anyatarasyam. Let's go over that again. Shvadehe Angasya Padasya Anyatarasyam Yaduktam Tad na Bhavati. So whatever has been told in the previous sutra, optionally it will not happen for this particular word. So very specific sutra for very specific word. So that's all about all the discussion on Adivruddhi. It took one full class, and in addition the yesterday's full class. So we have studied sutras from Taddhiteshvacha Madehe all the way up to, these last, I think, 4-5 sutras we did not really discuss, but sutras up to the Purvapada and the Uttarapada Vriddhi. So remember, there are 4 important sections in this particular sheet or in this particular Adivruddhi concept. First, we get an Akaradesha. Second, we get an Aich Agama. Third, we get an Uttarapada Vriddhi. And fourth, we get an Uttarapada as well as Purvapada Vriddhi. And then in some cases it is optional, some cases it is compulsory, and so on. So with this, we complete the first of the 3 important karyas, the Adivarna Karyam. In the next week's classes, we will go over the T Karyam and the Antima Upadhavarna Karyam. At least one class we will require for each of them, the T Karya and the Antima or Upadhavarna Karya. So that's all for today. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to send an email. We'll have sessions at the same time, that is on Friday and Saturday next week at 11:30 a.m. समापयामः। अष्टाध्यायी जगन्माता यस्य चित्तात् समुत्थिता वेदानाम् उपकाराय तस्मै पाणिनये नमः। शब्द ब्रह्म समाराध्य कृतवान् यो विलक्षणम् सर्वाश्चर्यमिदं शास्त्रं तस्मै पाणिनये नमः। येन धौता गिरः पुंसां विमलैः शब्दवारिभिः तमश्चाज्ञानजं भिन्नं तस्मै पाणिनये नमः। धन्यवादः।